First, my caveat. Don't believe a word I say. All right, I'm not a preacher. I'm not a politician. I'm not here asking for your trust or belief. I'm here to give you some information, and you take it, do with it as you will. If you're skeptical, that's great. I encourage healthy skepticism as long as you apply it all across the board, okay? Just because the government tells you something doesn't mean you have to automatically trust it. In fact, if experience is any teacher, we'll know not to trust it, okay? So let's move right along, because what I'm going to try to do is give you an overview of all of human history, and I've got about 30 minutes to do it in or so. So we're going to be talking about the hidden history. First, we'll start with the moon. We think we know about the moon, but we really don't. When I was in school, we were taught the moon was a dead world, and that there's just no air, no magnetic field, no nothing. And now we know quite the opposite. There's sheets of water that pass across the moon. They found water on the moon. There is a very thin atmosphere and a very thin magnetic field. It's just simply not what we think. And there's lots of oddities and anomalies on the moon. You know what an anomaly is, right? That's a scientific WTF. But here's the shard. It sticks up more than a mile off the moon's surface, just kind of out of nowhere. We have no idea what that is. Here's some pictures that are from NASA photographs. And you can see these weird objects flitting across the surface of the moon. You can see the one at the bottom where you're sticking out over a crater. The one I really like is this one from a NASA photo that shows these tracks. And you can see, oops, I'm having a hard time with this big one. See this guy? And he rolls along. Well, it looks like this may be kind of a round type rock that rolled off one of the sides of the craters and then rolled off into the plain area there. But if you actually get the actual photograph, the tracks go up the inside of the crater and then down, okay? And then, of course, you've got the one up closer to the top. So there's tracks. People have seen lights moving on the moon ever since they developed the telescope. In fact, I have a news story taken on Apollo 11 the day before Armstrong sat down on the moon. And they were talking about a light they saw coming out of a crater near Aristarchus. And at that time, it actually got in the news because the scientists were saying, well, it's probably volcanic activity, you know. Well, then we got to the moon and we found out there is no volcanic activity. So we really don't know. The key thing with the moon is how they got there in the first place, because early on I was told the moon somehow broke away from the Earth way back there. And this is why we have the giant hole in the Earth, which we call the Pacific Ocean. But once we got to the moon, we found out that the composition of moon rocks is just totally different from that on the Earth. So it didn't come from the Earth, it came from outside. So picture this, you got the Earth and here comes the moon, and it passes the Earth and gets caught in the gravitational field and gets pulled back. And over thousands of years, it finally should be in an elliptical, somewhat erratic orbit around the Earth, but no. It's in a near perfect stationary orbit right at the equator of the Earth, with one side always facing the Earth. Isaac Asimov, the famous scientist, science fiction writer, said the moon shouldn't be where it is, but it is. So how did it get there? The only thing that makes any sense is that it got parked there. Somebody placed it there. But now who would that be? And here's our circular thinking. We all know there's no such things as space aliens. We also know that the moon's been there as far back as recorded human history, so we know we didn't put it there. So we just won't talk about that. Also, we know that the moon is the exact distance from the Earth, so that when it eclipses the sun, it perfectly matches the corona of the sun. Again, that's just happenstance. It just happens to be that way. We also know that there are pyramids on the moon, just like there are pyramids on Mars. And this brings us back to the idea of, well, what about the pyramids on Earth? Well, of course, the most famous is the Great Pyramid, and they're now finding out that it's not even really made of limestone, as we've always thought. It's a kind of a polymer, a geopolymer, which also could explain then how they could have built this, because instead of quarrying huge stones and dragging them through the desert, they just built forms and poured it in there, and then it's set up. And we also know that the pyramid is not a tomb. I was over there a few years ago in Egypt, and there's Egyptians where they put hieroglyphics on everything, and their walls and their houses and their temples and then their burial chambers, and yet you go in the Great Pyramid, there's no hieroglyphics. There's something else about it. And I think I agree with Christopher Dunn, who did a very, very good job of explaining how the pyramid probably is a power generator, okay? And I think that what this means is that there was a highly technological civilization that covered the entire world at one time. We find, because there's pyramids everywhere, there's pyramids, of course, on the Giza Plateau, in Central America, South America, even in Bosnia. And by the way, if you want to see how things are being hidden from us, I met Dr. Sam Osmanovic, who is leading the excavation and study of the Bosnian pyramid. And he showed me photographs and films taken inside in the corridors, the hallways, the rooms, the grottos. But then I go to Wikipedia, and they got a whole page that tells me, oh no, it's just a natural hill. You know, that's not a pyramid. And so I'm confused. No, wait, who's telling the truth here? Last summer, one of my best and dearest friends went to Bosnia and participated in the excavations that are going on there, and she went down into the tunnels, saw the rooms, went in there. Folks, it's a pyramid. It's a giant pyramid. So we not only have pyramids now in Europe and in Egypt and in Central South America, we also know there's giant pyramids in China. And we also, in fact, that they have found giant pyramids underwater off the coast of Cuba. All right? In fact, all around the world, there are weird artifacts, anomalies, if you will, that point to human habitation further back than we imagine, and often with a highly technological civilization. When I was in Egypt, I went to Seti's temple at Abydos, and was looking there, and it was quite fascinating. I think I'll show you in a minute the helicopters they depict. But one of the people on our group said, "Have you seen the Osirian?" I said, "No, what's that?" They said, "Come on, let's go out back." We went out back, and up here is, if this thing reaches, up there is Seti's temple. Back behind it and down under it, obviously there long before they built Seti's temple, is what they call the Osirian. You notice these huge monolithic blocks piled up, okay? And usually it's underwater, but I happened to be there at a very unusually dry period, and you could actually get in there. I bribed a guard, and he actually pulled the 2x4s loose and let us go down the stairs and wander into this place. And it's immense, and they've got an aqueduct. I mean, this was quite a sophisticated place, and it was there long before the Egyptians came along. Okay, pretty soon the head of the guards came along and told us we had to get out. And since he was toting an AK-47, I decided, yeah, okay, all right, we'll get out. Okay, so they try to keep this hidden. They don't really want you to know about all this early stuff. But all over the world we have these things. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey just blows me away. That's one of the earliest things they found, with these intricate carvings. And then here what they found in Seti's temple looks like a helicopter, looks like a jet plane. And they didn't even know, that probably would have been destroyed too, except it was under. They were kind of renovating the place, and they pulled off a stone, and this was under it. So we found out that there's all this stuff going on. In our own country, this is a news clipping from a newspaper in 1909, and they were talking about all these Egyptian artifacts that they found in the north end of the Grand Canyon. Okay, and according to the story, all of this was excavated, taken out, and taken to the Smithsonian Institution. Now, we all think Smithsonian Institution is a world-famous, world-class, repository of historical and archaeological information, and that's true. But what you may not know is that the Smithsonian Institution, ever since the late 1800s, is an agency of the federal government of the United States. And so it's turned into a big black hole. Things disappear in there and never come back. And so now they say, no, we don't know anything about that, and there's nothing there, folks. And yet on the north end of the Grand Canyon, there are areas that are off limits. They won't let you go there. They say because there's dangers of collapse in some of the caves or whatever. And yet, if you check the maps up there, you find that on the north end of the Grand Canyon, we've got formations named the Tower of Set, the Tower of Ra, Horus Temple, the Osiris Temple, and the Isis Temple. Well, wait a minute, if they didn't find any Egyptian artifacts there, why are all these things named after the Egyptians? So what this tells us is that at some point there was a highly technological civilization on this planet. And of course, that's where we get the legends. It's only come down to us as legends and stories, and predominantly about Atlantis. And of course, there's a huge argument over, well, where was Atlantis? And some people say, well, it's off, in the Caribbean, in Bimini. It's an island in the middle of the Atlantic. It's the island of Santorini. No, it's the island of Crete. And there's even a theory that says it was located in the South China Sea. For me, I think the answer is all of the above. I think we're talking about a prehistorical, highly technological civilization that existed on this planet. And this even has come down to us in various writings. Manly P. Hall was a ranking Mason and a student of the Esoteria, and he wrote that, I can't read this, you can read it. In prehistory, the gods walk with men and produce these men of renown. And of course, this sounds strikingly familiar to the story of the Nephilim in Genesis, where the sons of God mated with the daughters of men and produced the Nephilim, the men of renown. So what are we talking about here? Oops, this thing's locked up. Obviously, we're talking about our people that came from outer space. God, I love machines. They work great until you need them. So the question becomes now we're down to back to ancient astronauts. And is there any way to get this thing going?
You should be able to do that.
Yeah, there we go. So the question is, what's the deal on ancient astronauts? Does that really work? And what we find is that you go all around the world, Asia, Africa, the Aborigines in Australia, and we find a common theme. Gods came from the skies, flew around, and told them stuff. And it all would go back to ancient Sumer, the Sumerians, which again depicted their gods in flying machines. And the Sumerians are really fascinating because in some of their early steles, and all this was written down thousands of years before the Bible was ever written down. And you notice here they depict the solar system, and they pretty accurately got the number of planets and the size in their relationship. And this is long before the Egyptians. Now I think I lost the sound. And the way we know all this is because of the clay tablets. And these are cuneiform tablets. Okay, test. Thank you. Okay, the cuneiform tablets, and it's amazing, but we actually can know more about the Sumerians than we'll ever know about the Egyptians or the Romans, because they wrote on papyrus, and that got destroyed in wars and burned up and deteriorated and went away, but the Sumerians etched everything in wet clay and then baked it. And there's about 500,000 of these tablets all around the world in museums, but they're buried down in the basement. And only about 20% of them have been translated. And but the ones that have been translated, we find that they, over and over, they say that 432,000 years ago, the Anunnaki came. Well, the Anunnaki are translated as those who came from the heavens and landed on the earth. But not only do they say that they came here and began to colonize, but they also talk about how that they were able to create a hybrid by, and they even explain how they did it. They said they took the sperm of an earth primitive and fertilized the egg of an earth. They took the sperm of an Anunnaki and they fertilized the egg of a earth female. And that then through cesarean section, they delivered the hybrid that they call the Adama, the Adam, hello, the earth man. And they even showed how they did that. They also showed that they had a knowledge of genes and genetic manipulation, cloning, if you will. And in fact, the stories passed down are all the same. The story that you all are familiar with about Noah and the great flood, that was all told thousands of years earlier by the Sumerians. In fact, it was the same story. His God told him to build an ark. There was going to be a flood, told him to put bitumen and seal it and blah, blah. And the rains came and he floated out, and then he let birds loose, and finally one didn't come back and he knew it was there, and they landed on Mount Ararat. Okay? It's all there, same story, except for two things. Number one, in the Sumerian, they had different names for the fellow. Utnapishtim was one, and in the Bible, of course, he's called Noah. The other one is small, but I think incredibly important. We're told that Noah took 2 of every animal in the world aboard the ark. And even as a kid in Sunday school, I had a problem with that. I mean, wait a minute, you got the lions laying down with the gazelles, you know, and how's that going to work? And but in the ancient Sumerian, it says he took the seed of every living thing. Oops. Now, instead of a boatload of animals, you got a closet with DNA samples, okay, to repopulate the earth. And of course they did, and the human population began to grow. Well, the Anunnaki, according to the tablets, got a little tired of the human population exploding all over the place and causing trouble. And any of y'all ever see the Star Trek episode about the Tribbles? Yeah, well, we're the Tribbles. So they came up with the 2 basic control mechanisms to control the humans. What first was religion. God told me to tell you, here's how you're supposed to live, and by the way, pay your tithe. And then money. But the strongest and the earliest one was religion, of course. And the way this came about is that according to the tablets, the Anunnaki didn't want to get their hands dirty messing with the humans, so they brought down what they call kingship. They appointed some of these hybrids, the ones that were maybe a little closer in the bloodline to the Anunnaki creators, and the ones that are a little smarter maybe, and they made them into a priesthood. And therefore, they could pass the word along to the priesthood, and the priesthood told everybody, here's how it's going to work. In fact, they even probably took steps to secure and identify their particular herd of humans from the others, because the Anunnakis, as they spread out, created their own kingships, and pretty soon you had these city-states, and pretty soon they were warring with each other. And of course, you can see where one of these Anunnaki overlords says he wants to keep track of his people, so he probably told them stuff like, we would put a clip and some kind of tag on the ear of the cow. Well, I think they told their people, okay, every male child needs to circumcise himself, That way I'm going to know who my people are. And this is where a lot of that got started. And then right alongside of that was the control mechanism of money. If you'll stop and think about it, that Jesus, the Prince of Peace, the one time that he really got physical and got kind of violent was with the money changers. And were they at the bank? No, they were in the temple. In fact, what you find is that the priesthoods begin to develop the secrets of money and control of money, lending money, et cetera, et cetera. More about that in a little bit. But the Anunnakis at the very top of the food chain, they kept going. And so the question is, what happened to these ancient gods? You know, did they all just go away? They're still here? I found it highly interesting when I began to compare the characteristics of the ancient mythological gods, whether it was Sumerian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman. The characteristics and dynamics were the same. Only the names changed because of the change in the language. Just for example, the Heavenly Father, the one who sees from above, and the Sumerians was Anu, the Egyptians it was Amun-Ra, to the Greeks it's Kronos, and to the Romans it's Saturn, but they're talking about the same people. In fact, it blew me away when I found out that we're all familiar with the Greek gods, the Titans, right? Well, in the Sumerian cuneiform language, Titan means those who live in the heavens. So it's the same deal. And also, I was always under the impression that we were dealing with all these ancient civilizations, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, blah, blah, okay? And then come find out, though, no, these are all devolved aspects of the original civilization. And I became convinced of this when I started studying the Egyptian civilization, because those of you who have know what I'm saying. The earliest dynasties were the most sophisticated. The Egyptian civilization seemed to just spring out of nowhere and then evolved until the later dynasties. Their jewelry, their writing, their artifacts were not nearly as good as the early ones. So they didn't build up, they built down all the way to what we call the Dark Ages, which was really the Dark Ages. For example, I found that the Great Temple of Solomon is the exact copy of a Sumerian temple to the Anunnaki god Ninurta. So where did the Egyptian civilization come from? Well, actually the Bible tells us. Abraham, okay, who of course is the patriarch not only of the Jews, but of the Arabs, all the Semites, okay? And read the Bible. He was Abraham, he came from Ur in Chaldea. Well, Chaldea was just an ancient term for Mesopotamia, for what we now call Iraq. Interestingly enough, one of the few places on the earth that you can't just freely go to, unless you want to join the army. And so he was a Sumerian. He wasn't Jewish. He wasn't an Arab. He was a Sumerian. He had the knowledge passed along from the Anunnaki, and he brought it into Egypt, and right after that, the whole Egyptian civilization sprang up. Now, you'll be able to find out all the details about this and much, much more in my book, Our Culture and History. But some of the secrets they passed along involved the white powder of gold, which some of you may know about, you may not. The Egyptians talked about it. They call it the white bread. They call it the mafuz. And the pharaohs in the Book of the Dead, they would pause on their way to the afterlife and say, what is it? What is it? They didn't know what it was. But it was definitely recorded. And then again, we find that this technology moved on into the Bible because the Hebrews, when they left out Egypt, and there's a whole thing there, you'll read about this too, that we think of Moses as the leader of the Hebrews, and yet Moses turns out is actually not even a name, it's a title, and it means the pretender, the rightful pretender to the throne. And I am becoming pretty convinced that Moses that we read about in the Bible is actually Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten. And if you'll study the Egyptian stories, we find that Akhenaten, or Amenhotep IV, was an offspring of Amenhotep III, who was a very jealous pharaoh and ordered that if there were any male childs born in his family that would have been pretender to the throne, they were to be killed. And of course, so when Amenhotep IV was born, they smuggled him away. This is all written down in the hieroglyphics. Put him in a basket, floated him down the Nile, and he was picked up by the servants of the Pharaoh, and who were the slaves of the Egyptians, the Hebrews. So he was raised by Hebrews, which instilled in him the idea of a monotheistic, one true God. And therefore, when Amenhotep III died, Amenhotep IV took over and changed his name to Akhenaten, the follower of the one true God. Well, of course, this hacked off the priesthood, threw Egypt into turmoil. But since the Pharaoh was a god, you couldn't kill him, okay? But you could banish him. So they sent him off and said, take whoever you want to. Well, he took not his birth family, but the family that actually raised him, which were the Hebrews, and he led them out of Egypt, okay? And he had the secrets that had come down through the mystery schools from the ancient Anunnaki. And one of these secrets was the secret of manna, a white powder that they would find on the ground when they wake up in the mornings, and they could take it, roll it in, add a little water, make it into little bread and cakes and eat it, and this is what sustained them in their 40 years in the wilderness. And manna in ancient Hebrew means, what is it? Same deal. And now we know that we call it orme, or orbitally rearranged monatomic elements, and there's been lots of scientific studies done to show that this is a mono atom, single atom entities, and oddly enough, you can take gold and through a smelting process you can reduce it to this white powder, and they've even taken the white powder and reversed the process and turned it back into flecks of gold. And they found that when they put this white powder in a weighing pan, in a weigh, that it actually weighed, the pan and the whole thing weighed 44% less than it did before you put the powder in it, which means it had some kind of anti-gravity property to it. And this is why that, according to tradition, the Ark of the Covenant was filled with this white powder. And that's why you see pictures of 2 or 3 guys carrying the thing around, and yet it's supposed to have a solid gold lid, and according to the account given in the Bible, that the mercy lid itself ought to weigh more than a ton. So how does 3 or 4 people carry a ton around? And it's because they weren't carrying it, they were just guiding it, because it's kind of about halfway floating because it's full of this white powder. We hear more about that again in the Bible in the story of Moses. He comes down from the mountain and finds the people worshiping it, and it says he burned it in fire and made them drink it. Well, if it's just melted gold, that would have killed them. So he was given the white powder. We also know that Sir William Petrie in 1914 found what he called the Temple of Moses on Mount Moses, which is also known as Mount Hebron in the Sinai, and under the flag stones there they found all this immense amount of white powder. That's where they were making it. I think this is maybe one of the true leading causes of our invasion of Iraq, because Saddam Hussein believed himself the reincarnated Nebuchadnezzar, and he was rebuilding Babylon, and I think they were beginning to discover the secrets of this ancient technology. Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, who headed up the investigation of the museum, said that it was an inside job and that they were after certain things. So we got future technology from the past, and it's all being kept from us. Except a lot of this knowledge got passed along through the Knights Templars, who then brought it over to Europe. And in fact, we can see that the ancient secrets moved from the Middle East, from Palestine, through the Greek culture, through the Roman culture, ending up in the foothills of the Pyrenees in southern France, which was the home grounds of the Knights Templars. The Knights Templars then formed these unions of stonemasons. And pretty soon the stonemasons, because they were one of the few groups able to travel unhindered through medieval Europe, so they were a great conduit of information and communication. And of course they in turn established the Freemasonry, which then broke into operative and speculative. Operative were the actual stonemasons who actually worked in masonry, and then the speculative are people like us who said, we want to join, we want to know what you know, but they weren't actual workers. George Washington, of course, was a big Mason. Also, he wrote in 1798 that it was not my intention to doubt that the doctrines of the Illuminati had not spread to the United States. On the contrary, no one is more fully satisfied of this fact than I am. So already this ancient knowledge was popping up in these secret societies. Now in Freemasonry, you got an outer circle, inner circle. If you ask a Mason about that, they're going to tell you no, because they're either a member of the outer circle, in which case they truly don't know about the inner circle, or they're a member of the inner circle and they've sworn a blood oath never to tell. I think also I'd like to briefly mention the Khazarian Empire, which you hardly ever hear anything about. But you'll notice that here it says Persia, and here's Baghdad. So this is just right north. And if you'll read the ancient Sumerian tablets, a cloud, when there was warfare, there were cities destroyed. I'm reminded of Sodom and Gomorrah, huge flash, a huge pillar of smoke. People turned to dust or ash, salt, okay? And there was a cloud that rolled through Mesopotamia and wiped out all life for many, many years. Sounds like a radioactive cloud. And the survivors all fled in various directions, but a lot of them went north, and they then blended in with the Mongol people there between the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea. And by the 8th and 9th centuries after Christ, they formed the Khazarian Empire. Now, the Khazarian Empire was about a third Christian, a third Jewish, and a third Muslim. And at that time, both the Muslims and the Christians declared interest on a loan usury a sin. You couldn't do that. Only the Jews said, well, it's okay to charge interest, especially if it's on the Goyim, not us. So the leadership of the Khazars, just like Constantine did in the Roman Empire when he declared the Roman Empire had become Christian, and therefore everybody in the empire became a Christian. They declared that they were Jewish, and everybody in the Khazarian Empire became Jewish. And these were the forerunners, and this is not sheer speculation. This was attested to in the Encyclopedia of Jewish History that I studied. This is where the Rothschild family comes from. Are they Jewish? Well, they profess to be Jewish, but they're not Hebrew. They have no connection whatsoever with Palestine. Sammy Davis Jr. Embraced Judaism. He certainly wasn't a Hebrew. Now, I'm the first one to admit that it's not right to discriminate against people because of their race or because of their religion. But the other thing is Zionism. Now, Zionism is a political movement started by the Rothschilds, started by these Ashkenazi Jews, as they're called, in Eastern Europe. And the whole idea of Zionism is they said, we need a homeland in Israel. Now, believe it or not, the biggest opponents to Zionism were the Orthodox Jews. And that's what the Holocaust was all about. And the rise of other secret societies such as the Illuminati. And it all came back again to religion, to political movements, and to the money. Benjamin Franklin even made it very clear that the American Revolution was not about a little tax on tea. It was the fact that they took away their money. The colonies operated on colonial scrip, which was equated with the work and productivity of the 13 colonies, and they were prospering. Well, but the British Crown and the bankers of Europe did not like this because they weren't getting their cut. So they pressured King George into passing a law that outlawed colonial scrip and forced the colonists to use British pound sterlings issued by the Bank of England, which was run by Nathan Rothschild, okay? And Benjamin Franklin said it was that which caused the Revolutionary War. The same thing happened in France with the revolution there. We get to World War, well, first let's talk about the war between the states. I hesitate to call it a civil war because, number one, there was nothing civil about it. And number two, it wasn't even truly a civil war. A civil war is where factions within a national boundary fight with each other. And this was the southern states that said, okay, we voluntarily joined this union, we're going to voluntarily leave it. And Abraham Lincoln, who just years before had said it was the right and the duty to people to rebel if they didn't like the government they had, he, of course, by then had been made president, so he changed his attitude. He said, no, he called up 60,000 troops and said, we got to put down the rebellion. But even German Chancellor von Bismarck said that this whole thing was concocted again by these bankers, by the Rothschilds, and that they egged on both the radicals in the North and the South to create the war. And by the way, Canada played a role in that because the British Army was in Canada And the French army under Maximilian was in Mexico. And the idea was to get the North and South in the United States to fight each other, you know, and to a draw and decimate both sides. And then they were going to move in and regain North America for the European bankers. And we can find this following straight on through. You get to the Russian Revolution. Woodrow Wilson said that the bulk of the money that went from the bankers of America and Bank of England to Russia at the time of the revolution did not go to the White Russians or the Kerensky government. It went to the Bolsheviks. So we created communism in Russia. And they were using the same 25 platforms or planks of the platform that the Illuminati had put forth. Meanwhile, in the United States, we had Paul Warburg, a German banker who came over here and helped run the secret meeting at Jekyll Island in 1910-11, where they concocted the Federal Reserve System. And in fact, he became the first chairman of the Federal Reserve System, and at the time of World War I was put in charge of the financing for the United States Expeditionary Force in World War I. Interestingly enough, his brother, Max Warburg, was a ranking member of the central bank in Germany and also connected to German intelligence, and he was running the war from Germany. So you got both Warburg brothers running both sides of the war. It's an amazing thing, and also Max Warburg also, by the way, sat on the board of the America Hamburg steamship line along with Prescott Bush, and it shows the interconnected of all this. So you got the upper bankers running both sides of World War I, and from the Illuminati, here's their platform. You know, you can read it for yourself, and it's an exact duplicate of the Communist Manifesto and the creed of the socialists. And then it was picked up by the Nazis, and that was basically the platform of National Socialism. In America, we weren't as dumbed down as we are today, and they actually kind of understood this. Here's a cartoon from 1911 that shows Karl Marx shaking hands with the Wall Street guys, and we knew about this. And so, but then what happened is that when Lenin and Marxism and extreme socialism called communism took over in Russia, all of a sudden Lenin died and Stalin became the dictator, and he, under his guidance, they had the International, and they were trying to export communism worldwide. Workers of the world unite. Well, this struck fear into the minds of the capitalists and the bankers, and so they said something's got to be done. We got to stop the spread of communism. So they went to Germany and found an army intelligence agent that they bankrolled, and he started up the German Workers' Party and then changed the name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And let me point out that communists were hardline socialists and the Nazis hardline socialists. And Churchill said, you know, we got to stop this German economic might, you know, and I don't care if it's in the hands of a Jesuit priest. And then you have people, both the bankers and big industries in the West and in Germany running the show. So let me run on through here. By the way, once Germany took over southern France, which was in late '43, Otto Skorzeny, their big commando, goes down there, and what does he do? He sends a one-word telegram back to Berlin, Eureka, because they had been studying the work of a fellow named Otto Rahn, and they found Solomon's treasure that the Knights Templars had brought over and stashed in the Pyrenees. You can read about that in my book, Sisterhood of the Rose. Well, they gave Germany some tremendous technological advantage, and they began to build flying saucers. They built the Bell. They were just way ahead of the curve. And they also had these 6-engine bombers that was all set to deliver an atomic bomb to Manhattan. Here's a 1942 Luftwaffe study of an atomic bomb blast radius on Manhattan. So why didn't they, if they had the atomic bomb, why didn't they use it? Well, because up until the end, they did not have a reliable delivery system. They had the A-10 rocket, but the guidance system wasn't perfected. They had the giant airplanes ready to go, but the airfield in Norway was not yet finished, and the war ended before they could do it. So what did they do? The U-boat, U-234, had the German jet fighter Messerschmitt 210 and 50 kegs of enriched uranium. And it was on its way to Japan, but all of a sudden it was diverted. It was not fired on by the Allies. It surfaced off the coast of America and gave itself up. And on board was not only this enriched uranium, but a scientist named von Schlichte, who had perfected fast fuses, which is what we needed for an atomic bomb. So sure enough, if you follow the chronology, we got the uranium at a time when we were not able to produce enough, except for one bomb. We set it off, it worked. That very day, the USS Indianapolis left for the Pacific with a bomb and with the materials. A week or so later, it was at Tinian, and a few days later, they bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Germans, the Nazis, swapped us nuclear technology in exchange for immunity. And they came and rolled themselves into our military-industrial complex. And then also under Operation Eagle Flight, they were able to roll into the business and into the military-industrial complex. You'll find all of this in my book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich. We know about the secret societies, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission. You notice the emblem of the Trilateral Commission, how close it is to the swastika. Richard already mentioned how the war was run on both sides. So these people are manipulating everything. One person came to power in the United States who I think was determined to try to put an end to this top-down control, and that was John F. Kennedy. But of course, we know what happened to him, and the evidence is clear. Here's how they jimmied with the evidence. The day after, the rifle was sent to FBI headquarters, and they had this report signed by Hoover saying no usable fingerprints were found on it. And yet the next day it was shipped back to Dallas, and on Monday morning it was sent over to the forward to the funeral home by two FBI agents. Paul Grudy, who was a good friend of mine, was the funeral director there, and he told me years ago, and has since said publicly, that he was there when the FBI put Oswald's dead hand on the rifle. And that night, Henry Wade, District Attorney of Dallas, said, "Oh, well, I mentioned we got his fingerprints on the rifle." And that's how that they just totally jimmied with the evidence. We also find out that there were documents. One document says the paper that they said Oswald carried the rifle in the book depository with matched wrapping paper at the depository, which is pretty incriminating. But in 1980, a similar looking document signed by the same file number, same date, same agent, and it said they were not the same. So what's going on with phony documents? Here's the Dallas Police Evidence Sheet that's published by the Warren Commission, and it shows that they had 3 spent rounds. Well, they're trying to tell us there was 3 shots found, so they got 3 spent cartridges. Okay, the problem is when they opened up the Dallas police files, I went in there and found out that they only had 2 spent rounds. So the thing you have to understand is that they lied to us all the way down the line. This is Gerald Custer, the naval technician who took the autopsy x-rays of President Kennedy, and he, along with the photographer Floyd Reeve, who took the photographs at Kennedy's autopsy, are now on the record saying that the x-rays and photographs you're being shown today and in the National Archives of the United States are fakes, phonies, not the ones they took. And you can see this for yourself, because here's an x-ray that seems to show the whole front right portion of his head's missing, and yet there's the autopsy photograph and he's perfectly okay. The real key to it is right here. This is an x-ray of Governor Connolly's wrist, and you can see where the large wrist bone was shattered. There are still more pieces of bullet in Connolly's wrist when they buried him than is missing from the bullet they said caused the wound. It's that ridiculous, folks. But it's a perfect case of, do you trust your government or your own lying eyes? They said, the autopsy itself said the wound was in the back, and we see in his jacket the holes in the back, and yet we find even here when the Warren Commission tried to explain their single bullet theory that went through his neck, they have to hold the straight edge 6 inches above his shoulder to try to make it work. Did they know, or were they bamboozled? They knew, because here's a page from the Warren Commission early on in January of '64. And they said we now have a picture with the bullet in the back, and it's below the place where the bullet came out the front. So they knew, so they just lied to us. I wanted quickly to point this one out. This one clearly shows the driver did not shoot Kennedy, okay? What they say is a gun is simply the top of Kellerman's hair, greased hair reflecting sunlight. But I'm going to skip on through some of this. These are the original plat maps made by the surveyors who were hired by the Warren Commission, and they said the Warren Commission altered their numbers. So when you see these computer simulations based on the government distances, trajectories, elevations, you know, none of them can be correct because they're not based on the correct numbers. This shows where they changed up the numbers to the ones they actually got versus the one they published. You have all seen this picture. Notice that his chin is broad, flat chin, and yet the Dallas police photo shows he had a small cleft chin. He was shown those pictures, and he said, well, that's my face, but that's not my body. My face has been superimposed on somebody else's body. To find out if that's true, we took the two known photographs of the backyard, turned them into a transparency, laid one on top of each other, and as supposedly two separate photographs with a handheld camera. Nothing should match, but Oswald's face is an exact match, confirming what he said. And did they know? Yes, they did know, because we see here from this Warren Commission exhibit, what pose are they using? The pose of a third photograph that was found 15 years after the assassination. No explanation of where it came from. So we have suppression of evidence, fabrication of evidence, alteration of evidence, destruction of evidence. All of these are criminal acts. And who do we point the finger to? His successor, Lyndon Johnson, and J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. And this is not sheer conjecture. Here's a letter from Evelyn Lincoln. Anybody know who Evelyn Lincoln is? That was Kennedy's personal secretary. And she was at his elbow day and night. If anybody knew what was going on, she did. And she says, it's my opinion, it was a conspiracy because there was those who wanted to get rid of him, and the conspirators in my mind were Lyndon Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover, the Mafia, the CIA, and the Cubans in Florida. Okay, thank you. You got it right, Evelyn. And the excuse for the Warren Commission was stated by John J. McCloy, who said it is utmost important that we convince the world that America is not a banana republic where the government can be changed by conspiracy. But folks, it is a banana republic. And you can find all that in Crossfire. After Kennedy's death, Johnson took over, and his whole cabinet was Council on Foreign Relations, which got us into Vietnam. Also, between 1964 and 1988, every election in the United States was determined by gunfire. I wish I could get into this one. This one's great, man. They even tried to assassinate Jimmy Carter, but he got stopped. They said nothing to it, and yet weeks later we find out they arrested Raymond Lee Harvey and Oswaldo Ortiz. Okay, and Carter canceled a TV appearance he had asked for and went into seclusion, didn't do anything, and lost the election to Ronald Reagan. So are we just a zombie nation? Yeah, we are. And this is real interesting here, but I'm going to skip on through it because we don't have the time. So we got war in Iraq, and we got curtailed liberties at home in Afghanistan. It all started with 9/11. And all I want to say about 9/11 real quick is that here is John Farmer. Who's John Farmer? John Farmer is a former Attorney General of New Jersey, and was the senior counsel to the official 9/11 Commission to study and report on what actually happened on 9/11. And he states that the official version of what occurred that morning was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. So the head of the 9/11 Commission said the story they told you is untrue. You need to remember that. There's also fall of the money, and I could explain how that for a deposit of and an outlay of about $125 million, they later recouped $4.6 billion. Follow the money. Here's the Windsor Hotel in Spain. It burned out of control for 2 days, didn't collapse. We got Jane Stanley on BBC, who on that day announced about 5 o'clock that the Solomon Brothers building, Building 7, of the World Trade Center had collapsed. And yet, even as she's reporting on it, it's still standing behind her. They got off the script a little bit, okay? Now, we now also know that a peer-reviewed chemical journal in Europe says that they have found traces of nanothermite at the World Trade Center, so they were demolished. But I think the key thing is that what do we know about 9/11? We know that these 19 crazed Muslim hijackers using little box cutters herded the flight crew and the passengers to the rear of the planes, took over and unerringly flew them into these buildings. Well, wait a minute, how do we know that? We only know that because the government told us that. How do they know? Well, because Ted Olson, who had been appointed Solicitor General of the United States by George W. Bush, said he got calls from his wife, Barbara Olson, a commentator for CNN, and that she said that they had overtaken the planes, they used little bitty box cutters, they herded people in the back of the plane. Okay, the problem is that didn't happen. First, he starts changing his story because he said, yeah, she called me on a cell phone, and then it was pointed out that in 2001, you couldn't use a cell phone from a high-flying aircraft. So he changed his story and said, well, she must have used the backseat radio phone. And yet it was found out the flight she was on, the plane she was on, did not have backseat earphones. And then in 2006, when they put Zachariah Mazzulli on trial, they brought in the FBI with all their documentation, and including the phone records for 9/11, and they said there had only been one attempted call by Barbara Olson, and it was, quote, unconnected. There was no call from Barbara Olson. How do we even know what happened? We don't. But what we do know is that we have global hawk technology, which means you can capture the onboard computer of an airliner, and you can fly it remotely, and you can land it or take off or whatever you want to do with it, okay, by remote control. And we now also know that on the morning of 9/11, over both the Pentagon and Manhattan, there was a huge white plane like this. This is the Air Force E-4B, which is the Flying Command Center. This is what could gain control over the flight computer of these airplanes. And by the way, I think we see the same thing happen with Flight 370. I think it's been captured electronically. It was flown to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, and the reason for that is because they were about to sell high-tech, cutting-edge defense technology to China, and it had been developed by a company called Freescale in San Antonio, Texas, which is partially owned by one of the Rothschilds, and the Carlyle Group, which is the Bush family and Henry Kissinger. And I don't think they wanted that to go to China, so they captured the airliner and at Garcia. Quickly on the Pentagon, you all seen this picture, of course, and we all have seen the picture of the Pentagon like this, where the wall collapsed, right? And you say, well, the airplane flew in and it caused that big hole. Well, let me point out, here is the hole prior to the wall collapsing. The wall stood for almost an hour before it collapsed. And if you can look, if you can see that it's at ground floor, ground level, it only goes up one story, 10 or 12 feet, and it's only about 20 feet wide. Now, you explain to me how a Boeing aircraft with a wingspan of 125 feet, a tail height of 44 feet, gets in a 12 by 20 foot hole, leaving nothing there. And by the way, supposedly, according to the official story, the wings folded back, the giant turbine engines fell back, the tail folded down, it was like a torpedo, went into the building, blew up with such intensity that it just melted the entire airplane. The wheel assemblies, titanium steel blades, you know. Hey, don't laugh, that's what they're telling you happened, man. You don't believe the government? Well, I'm here to tell you it's a lie, because I personally interviewed April Gallup, who was inside, and something exploded, and she and her small child crawled out through this hole. And number one, I'm going, well, how'd she get out if it was so intense heat that it melted the entire airplane? And then I asked her point blank, I said, did you ever see an airplane or even parts of an airplane? And she said, no. And then she said that while she was still recuperating in the hospital, government suits showed up, and she figured they were there to interrogate her and ask her what she knew. And she said, but all they did was keep berating her, saying it was an airplane. Say it was an airplane. You know it was an airplane. Told them about the airplane. And they were just pounding on her to get her to say it was an airplane. This is what an airplane crash looks like. There's junk everywhere. I know, I've been to more than my fair share of them. And here we see it, the lawn of the Pentagon, nice bright green, no problem. Where'd the plane go? So that was 9/11. Now, we know that we're getting bad food, bad air, chemtrails. They're trying to kill us. And why is that? Well, because as voiced by Prince Philip, who is a leading New World Order guy, he says the basic problem is overpopulation. Yeah, but is that really true? I don't think so. You can fit the whole 7 billion human population could live quite comfortably in the state of Texas. But they want to get rid of us. Again, Prince Philip, he says, if I come back and reincarnated, I want to come back as a deadly virus. Take care of the overpopulation problem. So folks, let me tell you something. This is not just rhetoric or an academic exercise. These folks want you dead. And you better start waking up. That's the $1 trillion conspiracy. So who are these folks? We can track all of this technology all the way back to the Anunnaki and all the way forward through the secret societies. And then we find out that nothing really seems to change. You see, in the United States, there's really not a two-party system. You got liberals, you got conservatives, you got Republicans, you got Democrats, and yet those are just wings of the same one party, the war party, okay? Now, they will fight over social issues like same-sex marriage and abortion and gun control and act like there's two separate parties, but there's really not, because when it comes to war and when it comes to foreign policy, they all operate the same and they take their orders from the international bankers. Here you notice that the makeup of the government, first we have the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, just chock full of council and foreign relations people. And then we got Bill Clinton come in, he's chock full of council and foreign relations people. And then we get George W. Bush come in, again, council and foreign relations people. You think, well, at least now we got Barack Hussein Obama, and surely that changes, but no, early on, all council and foreign relations people, okay? And you've got General James Jones, that was the security advisor for Obama, and he said, and this came right off the Council on Foreign Relations website, he says, at the most recent National Security Advisor of the United States, I take my daily orders from Dr. Kissinger. Filtered down to General Brent Snowcroft and Stanley Berger, who are also here. We have a chain of command in the National Security Council that exists today. So what's changed? Nothing. All right, in 2011, a study was done at the Swiss Institute of Technology that found out 43,000 internet and multinational corporations that are controlled by only 1,300 or so. And of these, they were controlled by 147 companies. And of those 147 companies, they were all pretty much under the control of like 20 banks with interlocking directorships and ownerships. Now that is extreme power and concentration. And they're run by little known outfits like the Exchange Stabilization Fund and the Financial Stability Board, which is in charge of our economy and the Canadian economy, because all this was signed on to at the G20 meeting. So, who is exactly trying to rule humanity? Well, we go back and we find that even the Caesars traced, and the Greeks, they all traced their lineage back to the ancient gods. Same thing. All of the leaders of the United States, for the most part, can be tracked back to two kings, one in England, one in France. I was amazed that in the election of 2000, Burke's Peerage, a very prestigious publication over in England, predicted that George W. Bush would be president. And they said because both he and Al Gore were both related to the Windsors, the royal couple in England, that the Bush family was a little more closely related, that everyone who was the closest relation to the Windsors got to be president. And that's exactly what happened. And now we find out through Lynn Cheney that the Cheneys and the Bushes are distant relations to Barack Obama. What? And not only that, but they're all related back through the Bushes, through the Windsors, Barack Obama, to the Hinckleys, the guy that shot Reagan. So what in the world's going on here? So if we assume the ancient tablets are true and there were these ancient astronauts, these Anunnaki, there's only two things. They either all left at some point or some of them are still here. And a close reading of history will show us that somebody's still here. UFOs, cattle mutilations, in crop circles. So there's only three possibilities. The ruling elite are trying to contact these ancient creators, or they're already in contact and they're being guided or controlled by them, or they are the ancient creators. So we have to ask ourselves, are they just greedy corporations and trying to run the countries, trying to run the corporations? Are they simply inept and stupid? Are they merely corrupt and malfeasant? Or are they even us? So there you have it, and I thank you. As the admonition says, keep voting. Pay your taxes, watch TV, don't question authority. And now I believe we're going to have some questions and answers.
Yeah, Jim, come sit down, and I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to a few questions from the floor.
Test.
And then just a reminder, of course, after we're finished here, we're all going to reconnoiter across the street and head over to the Pauper Pub and hoist a few jars. You're not interested in that, are you, Jim?
Can I wet my whistle?
Let's start with a simple question, Jim. Who are we? I mean, I know you mentioned we are the product of a genetic manipulation, but I put everything through my faith filter. I'm a Christian. Does that make me naive? I believe that, for example, Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He died, he rose on the third day. Does that make me naive? Am I misinformed?
No, but when it comes to your belief system, everybody's entitled to believe whatever they want to, whatever gets them through the night. But when you ask, who are we? Let's stop and think about this for a minute. I think we all realize, at least in the back of our mind, that science can recreate you. They can put flesh and blood together, bones, tissue, cells, but can they recreate you? No. Why? Because even though they could physically build you again, they cannot energize that body with the energy that is sentient, self-aware, that makes up the personality, the inner source of you, okay? We all know that we're energized. We all have an energy field around our body. The New Age people would call it the aura, and we know it's there. And interestingly enough, science tells us that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. And they've even done scientific tests showing that when a person dies, that energy field, it doesn't just dissipate, blow away. It lifts up, it moves off. And once you understand that, you'll understand that you, the real you, the thinking, knowledgeable you, you're not going to die, you're just going to go do something else. How liberating is that?
Another simple question. Now, I'm an avowed capitalist and a free enterprise. What's wrong with money? What is it and what's wrong with it?
Well, the Bible lays it out. The Bible has never said that money is evil. It says the love of money. Okay? So yeah, we all have to have money to get along, at least in the society we have now. Although, I'll tell you something, down where I live in Texas, there's a whole lot of bartering going on. Okay? You go over to your neighbor and say, hey, I need this. If you'll do this, I'll do this for you. And I think this is growing, and in the coming years, it's going to become more and more important. So just because somebody has money or wants to make money, that's okay, as long as they're doing it legally and as long as they're not hurting anybody. The problem is when you're after money for money's sake, and these rich and powerful, you see these people they have $200 billion. How much more money do you want, right? I mean, what can you do? But the problem there is their greed is not for the money per se, it's for the power that gives them with this money. And so you just have to, you have to reach your plateau wherever you're satisfied. If you have enough money to live on, you can get food, you can go to the show now and then, and you're okay. Hey, that's good enough, right?
You mentioned the state of Israel, and I don't need to tell you or anyone in this room that within the conspiracy field, let's face it, it's a big tent, and there are haters out there. I'm wondering if you could take a few minutes to talk to me about one of the problematic areas that has unfortunately tainted the work that many of us do, and that is the charges of anti-Semitism, and that there is this, and this is, quite frankly, very odious, that there is this overarching Jewish conspiracy. Could you take a few minutes to assuage us that that's not the case?
Well, I've often wondered about that. For one thing, we're talking about three separate things here. We're talking about Jews, which is the religion of Judaism. We're talking about Hebrews that come from the area of Palestine. They are Semites, as are the Palestinians. That's how I always throw everybody off. They say, well, I think maybe you're an anti-Semite. I go, no, I like Arabs. What? Because the Palestinians are the Semites, okay? And yes, there are Palestinian Hebrews who are also Semites. But the vast majority of people living in Israel today come from Eastern Europe. They are Ashkenazi Jews. They are Jews by profession. They are not Hebrews. Okay, but still, if you are of the Jewish religion, that's your religion. You have a right to that. If you're a Hebrew, that's the race you're born into. You have no real control over that. So it's not right to discriminate against people on those bases. But now, on the third hand, you have Zionism, which is a political movement, and which is not just entirely Jewish. There's Christian Zionists too. A lot of the far right wing in the United States are ardent Zionists, okay, because they've been sold this bill of goods that, well, we're God's chosen people and we're supposed to have this place in the Middle East. And when I say this bill of goods, because again, if you go back and really study, you'll find the biggest opponents of Zionism are the Orthodox Jews, because they say, wait a minute, we're still waiting on our Messiah, and when he comes, he will give us our homeland, and he will show us where we're supposed to go. And it's not right for us to go take land away from people that have been living there for thousands of years. So it's really a complicated problem, and it's not as black and white as they make it sound. And if you're interested in that particular issue, please just do your homework.
All right, let's move ahead a little bit. Yeah, thank you. The final chapter. If we're going to write the final chapter for mankind, I mean, what is the end game here? Where are we headed?
I think we're in a foot race, and we're racing ahead ever more quickly to see if we're going to end up with a total 1984 Orwellian surveillance society, or if we're going to finally get our senses about us and start acting locally and working locally and become truly free and democratic type people. Things are actually kind of hopeful. You don't really know about this now. Most of you guys do, because you go to this conspiracy culture, you read some of the books, and you kind of know this stuff. But if you think about your friends and neighbors, they just watch TV and they go along with the program. And yet there is a consciousness raising that's going on in the world today. This is what leads to the Arab Spring, and hopefully we'll have a United States Spring at some point, and they start waking up and realize what's happening. Because the good news is that there's more of us than there are of them. And if we'll just simply wise up, and they say, okay, let's go have a war with Iran. Nah, we don't want to do that. And just don't do it. You don't have to fight a big revolution. Our forefathers already did that. You guys broke away to a greater or lesser extent from the British Empire, and we totally broke with the British Empire. We just said no. So did Canadians, and so did others. I've been to Australia, and so did the Aussies, okay? So you just say no. And but you have to start doing this at a local level where you can actually do something. You're not going to change Harper, and you're not going to change Obama, and you're not going to change the corruption that goes on in the central federal governments, but you can change things at your local level. And if you're really idealistic and really fired up, then run for office. Get to be the local postmaster or local city council or whatever. And then when the feds come and say, okay, we've got to put up more cameras and we've got to put up more surveillance and we've got to put drones in the sky, just say, no, we're not going to do that. And I think it is possible that we can turn things around.
Well, based on your fine presentation, it would appear that these archons or who's ever running this planet have this planet in total lockdown. So that would suggest that changing things at the ballot box, even if we do it at the municipal level, seems rather unlikely or remote.
Well, it's pretty unlikely on the national level. I'm not that familiar with the situation here in Canada, but I know in the United States, thanks to computer voting, they can swing any election they want to. Plus, that's on top of just the overall corruption and money buying that goes on. For example, in the United States, if you're going to run for Congress, if you're going to run for president, vice president, all it takes is money. It takes lots of money because the way you get elected is you get on TV. And TV costs a lot of money for airtime. And plus, they don't give you credit, do they? Radio, TV, they want cash on the barrelhead.
That's correct.
For political ads, right? So it's whoever's got the most money gets the exposure, and they're the ones that get elected. But that could change too. If everybody realized that, and you go down to vote, you go, okay, you got candidate A, candidate B. Candidate A spent $5 million trying to get this $100,000 a year job, and this guy spent $20,000. You know, vote for the guy with no money. He may be your best choice.
Just a couple of more quick questions, and then I'll open it up to the floor here. JFK, couldn't let you go without asking you about JFK. How many Oswalds were there?
Years ago, I was in touch with an old former intelligence agent who'd been working in intelligence since World War II. And he told me that at one particular time, there was a particular period of time when there were as many as 6 Lee Harvey Oswalds running around. And at the time he told me that, I thought, what? What's he talking about? But now I truly understand. There's really no question. You can read all about this in the new updated version of Crossfire, that there were people impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald in the months and days leading up to the assassination. So just when you get to the Kennedy assassination, that thing is so fraught with coincidences and complications and people masquerading, and I mean, you know, it's a morass. And it was created that way because that is the cover-up. There's never been a cover-up in the Kennedy assassination in the classic definition of lack of evidence. In fact, it's cover-up by obfuscation. There's so much, and everybody can grab a little piece here and there and build a whole ideology around it, but that was the cover-up. No, it's all there. There's just a whole lot.
How many shooters and where were they?
Well, for my money, there was probably a triangulation of fire, which would, by definition, imply 3 shooters and maybe a backup person. So there's 6 people right there. And you got one from the North Grassy Knoll. You've got one from the Dowtex building. You got somebody firing a gun on the 6th floor of the school depository, but it was not Oswald, and it may not have even been from that the southeast corner window. It may have been from further west where the windows were wide open. That window that they said was the Oswald window is only about that far off the floor. And then the window itself is only open about halfway, so it's only about like this. So that's that far off the ground. And plus there's 2 2-inch pipes to the side of it. It would have been very difficult to try to get in a position where you fire off down Elm Street from that location. In fact, while you're at that, if you were a gunman in that window and you're trying to snipe at somebody, your shot is when President Kennedy turned from Main Street onto Houston and is coming towards you. Now you have a stationary target. Perfect shot. Okay, if it's a lone assassin. But we're told he waited until Kennedy had made a 120-degree turn, goes off down Elm Street, laterally downhill away from him with a tree intervening in the line of sight, which makes no sense at all unless you had to get Kennedy into the plaza so you can get this triangulation of fire. So I think there was and I think there were as many as 9 shots fired, but it was not 3 shots, it was 3 volleys of 9 shots all told. okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And I can almost account for all that, okay? Because you got one bullet that hit Kennedy in the back, you got another that entered the throat. That was an entrance wound, according to all the medical people at Dallas. So there's 2 shots. You've got, I think, actually 2 hit him in the right side of the head, but we'll just say 3. So there's 3 shots. The 2 shots that hit Connolly were 2 separate shots, so now you're up to 7 shots. You got one that hit the street. You got one that missed Nick James Cade. And so, you know, now you're up to 9 shots. And it was 3 volleys.
Wow. Sounds like everybody had a gun that day except Dan Rather and Jackie.
That's right.
All right, well, listen, let's open it up to the floor. I need you to really bear down here and forget about a preamble. Just get right to your question, and we'll work in as many as we can in the next, say, 10, 15 minutes before we hightail it over here across the road. So we don't have mics out there, but if you can shout out your question, and if need be, I'll repeat it for Jim. Okay, there's a man about midway with a checked shirt. Go ahead, please.
I'd like to ask Jim, what do you think of Dr. Judy Wood's information in her book about 9/11 and why he never mentioned it, and specifically about the hurricane that day that never seemed to show up in the news?
So the directed energy weapon supposedly responsible for bringing down the North and South Tower.
Exactly. I am familiar with all that, and you will find that I wrote about Judy Wood in my 9/11 book, The Terror Conspiracy Revisited. I think Judy Wood is onto something. I think there was exotic technology being used on 9/11, technology that the public was not aware of. I did mention in my talk the Global Hawk computer capture technology to take over those aircraft. See, I was onto that early on, but see, in 2001, nobody knew about that. You try to tell people, yeah, they can remotely capture an airliner and fly it anywhere they want to, they just look at you like you're nuts. But I already was aware of this because in the 80s, I was doing an interview with an airline pilot, and he suddenly popped off and said, you know, my job's just redundant. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, on the new wide-body Boeing jets, said the computer runs the aircraft. He said, I'm just there in case the computer breaks down. And so I was well aware that these computers were running the airplanes, and I was also aware that in the summer of 2001, a Boeing 737 took off from Edwards Air Force Base, flew to Australia, flew 12 missions, flew back, landed safely, and all the time with no one on board. It was remotely controlled. But this was technology that was not known to the people at the time. So when they pulled off 9/11, nobody could understand that they could capture those airplanes and fly them where they wanted to. Today, we know all about Global Hawk, and we know now drones, pilotless aircraft, that's a big topic now. Same thing with the World Trade Center. There was some very exotic technology going on there, and frankly, I tend to agree with Dr. Woods. I've met her, and I've heard all her arguments, and I think that there was some kind of very unusual technology going on. The only place I would differ is that she thinks that this beam weapon may have come from a satellite. And while that's possible, I think there's an even closer explanation, because I happen to know that at Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island, for some years they had been working on a particle beam weapon. And the idea was to try to see if they could stop a missile in flight, which has been the goal for many years. And if you all remember the TWA-800, okay, that was knocked down by this beam weapon. It was a military test. It was friendly fire. It was unintentional. They didn't mean to knock down the airliner, but it was late getting off. It was running parallel to Long Island, about 65 miles southeast, and climbed into the beam of this beam weapon, which was aimed at a missile that had been launched. So there was a missile, TWA-800. Everybody concerned basically was telling the truth. People said there was a missile, there was a missile. People said there was an unidentified aircraft. That was a target decoy aircraft that they were going to shoot the missile at. People who said there was a wavy light in the sky, that was the beam weapon. And even the government who said, well, a spark got in the central fuel tank and blew the plane up, which is essentially true. What they didn't tell you was, how did the spark get the fuel tank? And it's because when that plane was hit with that beam weapon, it fried the onboard computer and caused everything to flash and spark, and valves were opening and closing, and et cetera, et cetera. And if you go back and check, you'll find that Boeing Company, when they said it was a spark in the fuel tank, they started raising all kinds of lead, because they said, wait a minute, our planes don't just blow up. you know, and then all of a sudden, and even Senator McCain was totally against this, the Air Force got a deal where they bought 25 Boeings from Boeing Company, and they were going to use them for like 10 years, and then turn them back to Boeing. What a sweetheart money deal for Boeing, and after that they shut up about the TWA-800.
All right, this gentleman down here in the black hat, your question.
Jim,
Yeah.
today what's happening in Iraq? Are they ready for another world war?
What's happening in Iraq? World War III?
I hope to God that they got more sense than to try to pull off World War III, because that could be the end of all of us. Iraq, you know, that just blows me away, because I'm thinking back to 2001, after 9/11, in fact, after the first Gulf War. All of that was put upon, okay? If you go back, you find out that when Iraq took Kuwait, and supposedly Saddam Hussein became the new Hitler, he had not had any meetings with our ambassador, April Gladsby. And the one meeting he finally had this was before they went into Kuwait. He told her that he was upset about the Kuwaiti slant drilling into the southern Iraqi oil reserves, and that he wanted to regain Kuwait, which originally had been part of Iraq. It was artificially cut away by the British in the early part of the 20th century. So he asked our ambassador, April Gladsby, he says, you know, what are y'all going to do if I go and take Kuwait and return it to Iraq? And she said, well, I've been instructed to tell you that we consider that an Arab problem, you know. In other words, it's like, hey, do what you want to do. And so then when he moves into Kuwait, all of a sudden he's the new Hitler, we go to war with him. And then instead of ending that war, we just stopped, pushed him back in Iraq and said, okay, we'll stop here. And all they did was prolong the situation until we finally got to the next stage. And it's all just a deal. And the guy they pulled out of the hole, and they said, we've got Saddam Hussein, that wasn't even Saddam Hussein. The Russians applied some pressure and got him to let his wife of 25 years in to see him, and she came back out and said, that's not my husband. So, and we all know he had lookalikes and stuff. And if you'll stop and think about it, the people we've been talking about, these New World Order types, these world controllers, you're not gonna set somebody up as a major dictator and then just kill them off, because then you're not gonna be able to find anybody else to take the job, right? So we all know there's such a thing as the federal
Witness relocation.
Witness relocation program, thank you. And that, you know, they give you a whole new legitimate ID, and unless you talk, nobody knows who you are. And I think we all know Hitler got away, okay, lived out his days in Argentina. I think Timothy McVeigh and Ken Lay of Enron, I think, you know, we're told, oh, well, they died. And I think they're all sitting, drinking, sipping Mai Tais over in Haiti or somewhere right now, you know, or, and so, because it's easy enough to do that. And that's what they do. Timothy McVeigh, for example, the one civilian that got to sit in on his execution, said, well, you know, it's kind of strange, but when they hauled him out of there, he was still breathing. So who knows? And when you get to that level, you know, you've got private doctors who would, you know, say, yeah, he died, and you just go on.
All right. Lady Radehout here, midway in the black t-shirt. Yes.
Yes, so I am a Jew, and I've heard this theory before, okay? So are you saying that 6 million people who died in the Holocaust weren't Jews or Hebrews or?
No, let me talk about the Holocaust.
Hang on, I want to mention one thing. I agree with you about Israel and Zionism and the whole thing, so it's not that I'm pro-Israel, not at all, actually. The Christian evangelicals want Israel because isn't that where they believe on the plains of Megiddo, the apocalypse, the Armageddon will occur, and the Messiah, the second coming of Christ will occur. It's not just that they want Israel, there's a reason for it. They couldn't care less about Israel per se or the Jews.
Yeah, they want Jesus to
Unless
come
all of
back.
them convert, they're going to hell anyway. So can you comment on that? Thank you.
Oh, boy. First off, if you go back to the First World War, a story that got a very prominent play for a while was the fact that 6 million Jews had been massacred in Turkey. And then it turned out it wasn't quite right. And I think the number 6 million that gets bannered around is probably an inflated number. I could go into great detail about it, but in my thinking is this: if any number, I don't care if it's 6 million, 600,000, 600, or even 60, if innocent people are killed as a official government policy, that's a Holocaust, okay? So yes, the Holocaust happened, but the 6 million figure is kind of been bunted all around. And yes, you're right, the evangelical Christians have been really roped into the whole thing by the Zionists. And they, in fact, George W. Bush, I think, actually alluded to this a few times. They understand things are kind of messed up too, and they want Jesus to come back. And according to their theology, that's not going to happen until we have the Battle of Armageddon. And you mentioned Megiddo. When I was in Israel, we're on a bus heading up through northern Israel, and the bus driver said, "We're approaching Megiddo." Well, I was brought up to Baptist Sunday School, and I knew Megiddo was supposed to be the place where the Battle of Armageddon starts, you know, so I'm going, wow, what we got here? And I'm expecting to see a nuclear power plant or a military base or something. Looks like Southern California, orange groves, beautiful place, you know, pastoral, agricultural. I'm going, what's the big deal here about Megiddo? And then I get to talking, I find out that there are 3 main road arteries that come off the Golan Heights, and they all intersect at Megiddo. And from there, it's kind of equidistant to the port of Haifa, which is their big port, or to Tel Aviv, which is their major city. So all of a sudden I'm going, holy cow, if there gets to be another war and the Syrians come off the Golan Heights, and when they reach that intersection at Megiddo, that's when the Israel is going to decide if they want to use nuclear weapons or not. And I assure you, they have them and they will use them. So that's kind of spooky, because that might be the trigger of Armageddon.
All right, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more if we're quick. I want to go back to the lady in the blue top there. Yes.
I'm just curious, in your biography it says that you worked as an intelligence officer according to your career. Are you still a student? And is that why you're allowed to speak and write everything you do when so many people have been shut down or killed?
Are you an intelligence officer? Who are you working for? Who got you?
I can neither confirm nor deny. No, all seriousness aside, yes, I was in the Army, and yes, I was in the military intelligence unit, but our MOS was prisoner interrogation, okay? And I was mostly in a reserve unit. In fact, most of my service, other than a few times of active duty just for training, was picked about once a month to go down to the Army Reserve Base, and we'd tell the captain that we needed to perform maintenance on we had, I think, 3 or 4 Jeeps that were assigned to us, and we said we have to perform maintenance on the Jeeps. And so we'd get on a Sunday afternoon, we'd drive around the Jeeps and whistle at the girls in the park. That was my military service. No, I'm not a spook, never was one.
Jim, raises a good question though, Jim, and you and I have talked about this on my show, and that is, you are a New York Times best-selling author. How is it that you've been allowed, I mean, you're a damn fine writer, no arguing there, but I mean, if this is supposed to be, you know, locked down and kept from us, why is the New York Times allowing your information to get out?
Well, the New York Times does not allow it, okay? In fact, it's pretty interesting that they don't even review my books to speak of. And I've been very fortunate in that I've been published by HarperCollins. Well, that's Rupert Murdoch, okay? Rupert Murdoch, I'm sure, has reached his accommodations with the New World Order. But I don't think that he's an insider. I don't think he's one of them. He's just a guy who came out of Australia and made tons of money and knows how to make money. And he's, I think his basic concern is the bottom line, is he making money? I was just very fortunate in that back in the 70s when I had published Crossfire, I went around and asked everybody, what do you think's the next big, deep, dark, secret government cover-up? And almost unanimously, all across the country, from cab drivers to publishers, they said, we'd like to know what's the truth about UFOs. Is there really something there? I had a fellow right here today come up and said, I'm so confused. Do you think there's anything really there? Yeah, you know, they want to know. And so I wrote up a proposal and sent it off, and it hit the desk of a fellow named Robert Jones, who was an old guy, senior vice president of HarperCollins, who just by some stroke of fate had read Crossfire and then was really interested in UFOs and thought, I wish somebody with some journalistic credentials and would write in a balanced, objective way, would write about UFOs. And my proposal hit his desk and he bought it. And we published Alien Agenda to great accord. And then I wrote Rule by Secrecy, and then I wrote another one. And by this time, HarperCollins had made lots of money off my books. And what was really gratifying to me is that like Alien Agenda was, I think, published in 1997, and but it's still valid. And so anyway, I just kind of got my foot in the door. And now I think if they had their druthers, they'd probably druther not publish me, but they hadn't figured out how to tell the lower echelon why they're not publishing somebody who's made them so much money.
Well, thank God for that foot in the door, Jim. Listen, let's give it up one more time for Jim Marrs. Thank you, fellas.